January 17, 1943. 30,000 feet above occupied Europe, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses crawls through the thin, freezing air. Frost glitters on aluminum skin. Inside, men breathe through masks, eyes scanning for black dots that grow larger by the second. Enemy fighters. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, slicing upward from the sun. The bombers hold course. Gunners brace. The air vibrates with engine roar and heartbeats. A tail gunner locks onto a diving shape, a German ace rolling into attack. He aims ahead of the fighter, squeezing the twin triggers. The tracers streak forward and miss cleanly. The fighter's cannon flash erupts. Shrapnel rips through aluminum. The gunner's hands shake, instinct broken. He remembers the new instruction whispered during training. Don't lead. Aim behind. He lowers his sights just a fraction, fires again. The tracers trail behind the enemy's path, and this time, the Messerschmitt bursts into flame, spinning away into cloud. It defied logic. Every instinct said he should lead. But from that day on, the men who aimed wrong were suddenly shooting down twice as many planes. A mystery born from mathematics, fear, and survival that at the dawn of World War II. Air combat was transforming faster than any branch of warfare in history. In just 2 decades, the open cockpit biplanes of the Great War had evolved into roaring metal giants, aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and deadlier than anything imagined before 1939. For the United States Army Air Corps, later the U.S. Army Air Forces, USAAF, the belief was simple but absolute. The bomber would always get through. Heavily armed and flying in tight formations, bombers like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were designed to defend themselves. The theory promised that overlapping fields of .50 caliber fire from every angle would make attacking them suicidal. By 1942, that theory was crumbling over Europe. The Luftwaffe was tearing through unescorted bomber groups. German fighters, agile, fast, and flown by veterans, exploited every weakness in the Americans' formations. In daylight raids over France and the Ruhr, losses climbed at an unsustainable rate. Crews were being shredded by cannon fire long before they reached their targets. The problem wasn't courage. It wasn't discipline. It was science. Early gunnery doctrine had been built on the wrong assumptions, borrowed from ground marksmanship, not aerial combat. Airmen were trained to lead the target, to fire ahead of its path. The idea was that bullets took time to travel. By aiming slightly ahead, the enemy plane would fly into the stream of fire. It made perfect sense, on paper. But in the sky, reality twisted those rules. At speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, with both shooter and target moving on different vectors, the concept of ahead or behind became relative. The curvature of flight paths, the time delay of tracers, the vibration of the aircraft, all distorted human perception. Gunners who trusted their instincts often fired exactly where logic told them to, and missed by feet, sometimes by yards. Training films and manuals in 1941 still taught instinctive firing. Trainees practiced on ground ranges, stationary or with slow-moving targets. The result was disastrous when transferred to combat. Instructors at early gunnery schools, such as Tyndall Field in Florida and Las Vegas Army Airfield, noticed an alarming pattern. Students who excelled in static ranges failed miserably against moving, simulated targets. By mid-1942, bomber losses were becoming critical. The 8th Air Force, newly based in Britain, saw entire squadrons vanish over the continent. On August 17, 1943, during the first Schweinfurt raid, 60 B-17s failed to return, nearly 20% of the attacking force. Analysts searching through wreckage and gun camera footage began to suspect something deeper than bad luck. In debriefings, surviving gunners described firing hundreds of rounds without a single confirmed hit. It felt like they flew through the tracers untouched, one gunner recalled. Others swore they saw rounds pass through the enemy's tail without effect. But camera analysis revealed the truth. They weren't missing by chance. They were missing because their eyes lied to them. The human brain couldn't accurately process relative motion at those speeds. A fighter attacking head-on might only appear in view for 2 or 3 seconds. By the time the gunner adjusted, the geometry had changed completely. The paradox was deadly. The faster the enemy came, the more the gunner's instincts betrayed him something had to change. By late 1942, the Army Air Forces began an unprecedented scientific investigation into aerial gunnery. Psychologists, physicists, and engineers were brought in. Among them were men like Colonel Frank A. Armstrong, the real-life inspiration for the film 12 O'Clock High, who insisted that precision could be taught if the data were understood. Gun cameras mounted in training aircraft began capturing thousands of hours of combat footage. Every frame was analyzed. Engineers measured tracer lag, bullet trajectory, airspeed differentials, and deflection angles. The discovery stunned them. The tracers, the bright red and orange streaks used to help aim, did not actually trace the bullet's true path. They lagged behind it. What the gunner saw through his sights was an illusion. The solution would sound absurd to anyone outside the science. To hit a plane traveling at 350 miles an hour, the gunner needed to aim behind it. This revelation contradicted every instinct, every piece of training, every muscle memory. But the numbers didn't lie. The Air Forces began rewriting the rulebook. New training methods, new simulators, and new optical devices were developed to retrain thousands of airmen across multiple theaters. And soon, the doctrine that had once cost so many lives would transform, not through luck, but through an understanding of physics itself. The revolution began not in the skies of Europe, but in the classrooms and firing ranges of America, in the deserts of Nevada, the coastlines of Florida, and the plains of Texas. A quiet revolution in aerial warfare was taking shape. The United States Army Air Forces had realized that courage alone could not bring a bomber crew home. To win the air war, their gunners would have to become scientists, masters of motion, distance, and deception. By 1943, the flexible gunnery school program was in full swing. 6 massive training centers were established, each processing thousands of recruits every month. Their mission was singular: turn farm boys, mechanics, and students into precision aerial marksmen. The curriculum was unlike anything in military history. Trainees spent weeks learning geometry, trigonometry, and ballistics before ever touching a machine gun. They studied bullet drop, air resistance, and the cone of fire. Then came live practice, not on stationary targets, but on moving ones that simulated enemy fighters darting across the sky. To train their reflexes, instructors introduced skeet shooting, firing shotguns at clay pigeons moving at unpredictable angles. At first, many recruits resisted. "I came here to shoot Germans, not birds," one trainee wrote in his diary. But the technique worked. The movements required to track a clay pigeon's path mirrored the split-second decisions needed to hit a diving fighter. Still, even with improved reflexes, the accuracy problem remained. Enter the gun camera. Mounted on aircraft and training turrets, it recorded exactly where gunners aimed during simulated attacks. When these films were replayed in slow motion, patterns emerged. Over and over, tracers passed harmlessly ahead of the target's flight path. The bullets, invisible to the human eye, were actually trailing behind the tracer line. It was a subtle but devastating illusion. The tracer round, loaded with a burning phosphorus compound, was lighter than standard ball ammunition. As a result, it slowed faster in flight. What the gunner saw was the tracer streaking through the air slightly behind the real bullet stream. But because his eyes followed the glowing line, he instinctively adjusted forward, unknowingly pulling his aim ahead of the enemy. To correct this, the Army Air Forces introduced an entirely new aiming philosophy. Gunners were retrained to fire behind the target's apparent position, compensating for tracer lag, deflection, and relative velocity. It defied everything they'd been taught. Instructors faced skepticism, even ridicule. "You're telling me to miss on purpose?" one veteran asked. But soon, the data proved the method worked. Behind this change stood not only new doctrine but also new technology. Engineers at SPAE, General Electric, and Bendix were designing advanced sighting systems, computing gunsights, that performed the complex mathematics of aerial deflection automatically. The most revolutionary of these was the N6 computing gunsight, fitted to the SPAE ball turret beneath the B-17 and B-24. It measured the gunner's tracking speed, range estimate, and the target's angular motion, then adjusted the reticle electronically to indicate the correct point of aim, which, more often than not, was behind the visible target. In other positions, waist, tail, and dorsal, mechanical compensators helped approximate the same correction. The more crews trained with these systems, the more their results began to change. At Tyndall Field, test squadrons using the new aim-behind method achieved over 60% higher hit probabilities during mock engagements. Instructors realized they weren't just teaching men to shoot, they were teaching them to think in vectors. The implications rippled across the air war. As the 8th Air Force prepared for deeper raids into Germany, these recalibrated gunners became its shield. Thousands of new airmen arrived in England armed with something their predecessors never had: mathematical confidence. By mid-1943, this doctrine began spreading to the Pacific. B-24 Liberators of the 13th Air Force used it against Japanese Zeros over the Solomon Islands. Reports soon echoed what Europe had discovered. Gunners who aimed behind were hitting more often and surviving longer. Instructors no longer spoke of instinct, but of physics. Every turret became a laboratory in the sky. Every tracer a test. From these ranges and simulators emerged an entirely new breed of airman. One who trusted the data over his eyes, who fired not where his target was, but where mathematics said it should be. And when these men climbed into the silver bellies of the flying fortresses crossing the English Channel or the vast Pacific, they carried with them more than ammunition. They carried an invisible weapon: understanding. The stage was set. The doctrine was ready. Now, the true test would come, not in classrooms or gun ranges, but in the killing skies over Europe and Japan. The transformation of U.S. aerial gunnery during World War II wasn't just a matter of physics. It was human, mechanical, psychological, and deeply personal. Behind every burst of tracer fire was a man fighting terror, exhaustion, and the overwhelming urge to trust his instincts. The human angle, inside the fortress. At 30,000 feet, war was cold, loud, and suffocating. In the belly of a B-17, men crouched in steel compartments barely large enough to move. The temperature outside dropped to 60 degrees below zero. Bare skin froze instantly to metal. Oxygen hissed through rubber masks. The air reeked of oil, cordite, and fear. Each gunner knew his odds. In 1943, a bomber crewman's chance of surviving 25 missions over Europe was less than 1 in 4. Many never finished 10. The waist gunners stood in open hatches, exposed to the wind and sky. The tail gunner, the most isolated man in the world, stared down the bomber's trail, his knees tucked beneath twin .50 caliber Brownings. He was the last line of defense against the enemy. To these men, the difference between life and death often came down to a fraction of a second and the smallest shift of a gun sight. Training had drilled one truth into them: always lead the target. But the new doctrine demanded something unnatural: aim behind. Even the act of doing so felt wrong, like letting the enemy escape. Yet as weeks of training proved, the paradoxical method turned fear into focus. The gunner's job was not to hunt the enemy, it was to calculate him. To watch the world blur into motion and trust the invisible mathematics of the sky. The technological angle, the .50 caliber and its secrets. The weapon that defined the American bomber was the Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun, a marvel of engineering born in the interwar years. Each fired 750 rounds per minute, with an effective range of over a mile. But even such power meant little without accuracy. Every B-17 carried up to 13 of these guns, manned by 10 men working in coordination. Their arcs of fire overlapped like the petals of a steel flower. Yet coordination was only effective if each gunner understood the physics of what he was seeing. The .50 cal bullet left the muzzle at roughly 2,900 feet per second. But when both aircraft moved at hundreds of miles per hour, the bullet's flight time stretched into fractions of a second that changed everything. A German Bf-109 making a head-on attack might close from 1,000 yards to point-blank range in 2 seconds. The gunner's tracers appeared to streak toward it, but the fighter's speed meant it had already moved before the bullets arrived. Engineers measured these delays to the millisecond. At standard engagement distances, they found the bullet lag could equal the width of an entire aircraft, enough to turn a lethal burst into empty air. This was why the aim-behind concept became essential. It wasn't guesswork, it was correction for physics. The gunner had to fire not where his eyes saw the enemy, but where his rounds would intersect the enemy's flight path after the delay. The .50 cal Browning was both forgiving and punishing. Its spread of fire, a natural vibration pattern called dispersion, could save an off-target burst or waste an entire belt of ammunition. The most skilled gunners learned to ride that rhythm, timing their bursts to when the bomber banked or jolted. In the ball turret, the world spun in every direction. The gunner lay curled in a glass sphere, the earth wheeling below, the sky above. His twin Brownings responded to the slightest movement of his hands and feet. Inside, he had no horizon, only motion. And motion, in this new doctrine, was the key to survival. The training angle, schools of science and fear. At the gunnery schools, recruits were broken down and rebuilt into human targeting computers. Each day began before dawn. Trainees lined up on the firing range, practicing tracking exercises with wooden models on wires. In classrooms, they studied films shot from combat aircraft, pausing frame by frame to calculate angles of deflection. One of the most revolutionary tools was the camera gun, a modified gun sight that filmed through its lens every time the trigger was pulled. When played back, instructors could show exactly where each student had aimed. The evidence was brutal and honest. "Most of you missed by a mile," an instructor would say, freezing a frame that showed traces flying harmlessly ahead of a moving target. But then, when students adjusted and aimed behind, the results changed instantly. Target after target exploded in simulated fire. The motion analysis method, as it was called, replaced instinct with data. To simulate combat stress, trainees were placed in turret domes mounted on moving trucks or swiveling platforms. Targets raced across screens at 300 miles per hour. In the final phase, they fired from AT-6 Texan trainer aircraft at radio-controlled drones. These schools became factories of precision. Each graduate received a silver gunnery badge, and a sense that he carried the weight of physics itself into war. The lessons spread quickly. By 1944, the aim-behind principle was printed in field manuals and taught across all bomber commands. The British RAF Bomber Command adopted similar techniques, as did the Navy's carrier-based gunners in the Pacific. From those training fields rose men who would man the turrets over Berlin, Ploesti, and Rabaul. And soon, the skies would bear witness to how theory and terror collided. The next shift in this story belonged to the enemy, the pilots who faced this invisible adjustment and suddenly found their familiar attack patterns unraveling. The enemy angle, when the hunters became the hunted. For the German Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, attacking American bombers had once been almost routine. In 1942 and early 1943, B-17s and B-24s lumbered through the sky like wounded giants. Their formations looked fierce, but experienced fighter pilots knew the truth. The gunners' fire was erratic. German aces like Egon Meyer, Walter Dahl, and Adolf Gorland had perfected head-on assault tactics. They approached directly from 12 o'clock high, using the bombers' forward momentum to cut their exposure time to mere seconds. Their 20mm cannons could tear through a B-17's nose before most gunners managed to aim. In the Pacific, Japanese Zero pilots executed lightning-fast climbing attacks, firing short bursts before rolling away. They understood that American tracers often overshot their mark, that the bombers' defensive fire lagged just behind their evasive maneuvers. But by late 1943, something changed. Suddenly, attacks that once succeeded ended in disaster. Fighters rolled into their runs and found themselves flying into walls of perfectly placed fire. Entire formations of FW-190s disintegrated mid-dive. Zeros vanished in bursts of flame before they could even roll clear. Combat camera footage captured their confusion. The American gunners were no longer spraying, they were predicting. German intelligence units, analyzing recovered gun camera films from downed bombers, noticed something strange. The Americans were consistently firing not at the lead point of attack, but slightly behind. The Luftwaffe's tactical memoranda from 1944 include several notes warning pilots to avoid flight paths that expose the fuselage to trailing fire. For the first time, bombers that once looked like helpless targets became killing zones. And as the Luftwaffe's experienced pilots dwindled, replaced by younger, hastily trained flyers, the aim-behind doctrine became a silent executioner. The scientific angle, data that redefined war. The science behind the aim-behind revelation came from painstaking analysis. In 1943, the U.S. Army Air Force's Board of Operational Research began gathering film reels from thousands of combat sorties. Each frame, thousands of feet of black and white celluloid, became a map of mathematical truth. Physicists calculated angular velocities and parallax errors frame by frame. The data revealed a universal constant. Gunners were consistently aiming too far ahead. The delay between visual cue, human reaction, and bullet travel created a measurable lag. By the time a gunner perceived a fighter's position, his target had already moved. The brain simply couldn't compensate in time. Tracers, thought to be the gunner's best friend, turned out to be his greatest deceiver. Their apparent glow led the eye forward, masking the true ballistic curve. Engineers proposed compensating by training the eye to fire late, effectively teaching reflexes to wait an imperceptible fraction of a second longer. That fraction changed history. Mathematicians from MIT and Caltech assisted in designing sighting tables. For example, a fighter closing at 400 miles per hour required a deflection of roughly 3 degrees at 600 yards, yet the tracer illusion caused gunners to overlead by nearly twice that amount. The corrective offset, aim behind, was codified into a simple rule of thumb: 1 plane length behind at 400 yards. It was crude but effective. Tests at Eglin Field confirmed it. Over thousands of simulated attacks, hit rates doubled when the new doctrine was applied. The air war statistics soon reflected the math. After the second half of 1943, bomber groups with retrained gunners reported 50 to 70% fewer losses to fighter attacks. It was one of the earliest examples of data-driven warfare, an invisible battle fought with film reels, equations, and human adaptation. The leadership angle, reformers and visionaries. No doctrine evolves without men who risk their reputations to change it. Colonel Frank A. Armstrong, commander of the 306th Bomb Group, was among the first to question the effectiveness of U.S. gunnery in early missions over Germany. His after-action reports criticized not the men but the system. "We are teaching instinct where we need to teach geometry." He pressed for improved gun sights, camera analysis, and mathematical training. His insistence drew resistance. Many senior officers believed combat instinct was unteachable. But Armstrong and others persisted, turning bases like Molesworth and Thurley into laboratories of tactical reform. Meanwhile, Major Charles W. Carpenter, an instructor at Tyndall Field, pioneered new visual techniques. He taught recruits to picture the enemy's future position as a moving ghost, a phantom they aimed for instead of the visible aircraft. This visualization method, later formalized as predictive gunnery, became a standard tool in training manuals. Another critical figure was Captain Louis K. O'Rourke, an engineer attached to the Army Air Force's Proving Ground Command. He oversaw the installation and testing of the N6 computing gunsight, ensuring it could withstand freezing altitudes and vibration. When results came back showing doubled hit probabilities, O'Rourke's data convinced even skeptical generals. These leaders bridged the gap between laboratory and battlefield. They saw that the future of warfare lay not in stronger armor or faster engines, but in teaching the human mind to adapt faster than instinct could follow. Their efforts culminated in a quiet transformation across every Air Force gunnery school. Posters once urging "lead your target" were replaced by new slogans. Trust the data. Fire behind. By 1944, this doctrine had reached the skies of Germany and Japan, where it would meet the ultimate test in fire and blood. The next phase of this story is where the theory left the classroom and entered the crucible of combat. There, amid contrails and chaos, men discovered that a simple change in how they aimed could decide whether a crew lived or vanished into cloud and smoke. February 1944. The skies over Germany burned white with contrails. Thousands of bombers from the 8th Air Force thundered eastward, silver arrows carrying tons of high explosives toward the industrial heart of the Reich. Below them, the Luftwaffe prepared its counterstroke. For nearly 2 years, daylight bombing had come at a terrible cost. The 8th Air Force had lost over 2,000 aircraft since arriving in England. Crews rotated in and out with haunting speed. The airfields of East Anglia had become graveyards of shattered aluminum and empty bunks. But this time, something was different. The men in those bombers had trained under a new doctrine. Their hands no longer moved on instinct. They moved on calculation. They knew the mathematics of survival. They had practiced it under the Florida sun. And now they would test it over Germany's frozen heart. The second raid on Schweinfurt, February 24, 1944. The target was the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, the same city that had cost 60 B-17s the previous August. Now, 750 bombers flew the route, bristling with guns. As the formation crossed the Rhine, radar picked up dozens of enemy contacts. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s swarmed the formation. The German fighters rolled and dived through the thin air, attacking in synchronized waves. The bombers held steady. Inside the tail turret of one B-17 named Liberty Bell, Staff Sergeant Harold Jensen saw a 190 streaking in from 6 o'clock high. He had seconds, maybe less. In 1943, he would have led the target, pulling the triggers ahead of the fighter's path. But training had rewired his instincts. Now he aimed behind, a fraction low and late. The tracers seemed wrong, streaking past empty air, until the 190 flew straight into the invisible path of the bullets. It vanished in an explosion of smoke and flame. Jensen didn't cheer. He didn't even think. His hands were already moving to track the next attacker. All across the formation, similar moments unfolded. Fighters dove through defensive fire that looked misplaced, only to be hit mid-roll, mid-climb, mid-turn. Gunners were no longer reacting. They were predicting. Each turret became an independent fire control system, each gunner a human computer. By day's end, the U.S. formations had lost 33 bombers, still heavy, but far less catastrophic than before. Luftwaffe losses were stunning. 33 fighters destroyed, 17 probable, and dozens more damaged. It marked the first Schweinfurt raid where the bomber groups claimed near parity in exchange. The results weren't coincidence. The gun camera footage and after-action reports confirmed it. Gunners who consciously aimed behind recorded 2 to 3 times as many confirmed kills as those who reverted to instinct. And those numbers echoed across the warfront. The doctrine takes hold. Word spread quickly through the airfields of England. In briefings, instructors drew diagrams on chalkboards, showing the bullet arc, tracer lag, and invisible intersection. Crews began comparing hit rates between sorties, analyzing film footage late into the night. Even among skeptics, the evidence was undeniable. The 8th Air Force Tactical Development Unit summarized it bluntly. Most gunners miss by leading too much. The correct point of aim is generally behind the apparent target. Adjust accordingly. From that point, the aim-behind rule became gospel. In the Pacific, B-24 crews of the 5th and 13th Air Forces began applying the same corrections. Japanese Zero pilots, once masters of agility, now faced bursts that seemed to anticipate their moves. Many simply never saw what hit them. By the summer of 1944, as Allied bombers blanketed Europe in preparation for D-Day, American gunnery reached its lethal peak. Reports from the 305th Bomb Group showed that average rounds fired per kill had fallen by nearly 40%. Gunners who once needed 2,000 rounds to down a single fighter were now doing it with 1,200, sometimes fewer. It was a shift not in weapons or numbers, but in understanding. For the first time in the air war, mathematics had outmatched instinct. The change was invisible to anyone looking up from the ground, but inside those bombers, it felt like survival finally had a formula. And yet, even as the doctrine proved itself over Europe, it would face its most brutal test in the Pacific, where speed, maneuverability, and desperation pushed the human mind to its limits. There, over the wide expanse of the Pacific, the aim-behind method would meet an enemy that refused to break, and a new weapon of war that made even the best-trained gunners question their own reflexes: the Pacific Trial, the B-29s, and the final air battles. By late 1944, the war had shifted across the world's largest ocean. From the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, a new machine, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, carried the fight to the Japanese homeland. It was the most advanced bomber ever built. Faster, higher flying, and deadlier than anything that had come before. But even it wasn't safe. Japanese fighter pilots, flying Ki-84 Franks, Ki-61 Tonys, and the aging but nimble A-6M0, were determined to bring down the giants that now darkened their skies. Their attacks came fast and ferocious, often head-on, sometimes suicidal. The gunner's world once again became a few seconds of motion, vibration, and fear. For the men of the 20th Air Force, the lessons of Europe arrived just in time. Inside a B-29's pressurized cabin, surrounded by electronic sights and analog computers, gunners applied the same strange principle that had saved the fortresses over Germany: aim behind the target. But this time, they weren't alone in the calculation. The Central Fire Control Revolution. The B-29 introduced a marvel of wartime engineering, the Central Fire Control System, a network of electrically driven, remotely operated turrets. Each gunner sat behind a sighting station equipped with a General Electric computing gunsight that automatically calculated lead, range, and bullet drop. This sighting system, an evolution of the earlier N6, turned the aim-behind concept into pure mathematics. The gunner simply tracked the target with his control handle. Gyroscopes and mechanical integrators did the rest, adjusting the turret's aim by fractions of a degree in real time. What had once been intuition was now computation. In combat over Japan, this system proved devastating. On January 27, 1945, during the massive daylight raid on the Kawasaki Aircraft Works near Tokyo, more than 70 Japanese fighters attacked the formation of B-29s from the 73rd Bomb Wing. Within 10 minutes, gunners claimed 33 enemy aircraft destroyed. Post-mission analysis confirmed 19, still a stunning number. Crews credited not just the new sights, but the doctrine behind them. "We learned to let the system do what we used to fight," one B-29 gunner wrote. "You hold steady, you aim a little behind where your gut tells you to, and the tracers walk right into them." The philosophy of defiance, aiming wrong to be right, had become the foundation of precision gunnery. The kamikaze challenge. But then came the kamikazes. In late 1944 and into 1945, Japanese tactics shifted from air combat to suicide attacks. Fighters no longer turned away after passes. They dove straight into bombers or ships. Their closing speeds reached 400 to 500 miles per hour. Even the best computing sites struggled to keep up. Now, the gunner's world collapsed into seconds. The aim-behind rule still applied, but it became an act of faith. At those speeds, even the electronic sight's predictive system required time to stabilize, time that no longer existed. The gunners relied on their training, on a reflex now ingrained deep enough to override panic. Film footage from B-29 tail cameras shows gunners holding fire until the last moment, then squeezing the triggers late, the tracers appearing almost too slow, and striking true. Many of these engagements ended with both aircraft destroyed, the bomber limping home in pieces. Each hit was measured not in kills, but in survival. It was the purest distillation of the doctrine's philosophy, the courage to delay when instinct screamed to fire. Doctrine to doctrine, from field to command. By 1945, the aim-behind principle was no longer a tactical trick, it was official U.S. Air Force's doctrine. Gunnery manuals explicitly taught the phenomenon of tracer lag and instructed gunners to offset forward aim by apparent lag error. This scientific correction became the foundation for post-war training and even early jet-age air combat schools. The Army Air Force's own Aerial Gunnery Manual No. 9 declared, "Tracers deceive the eye. Their lag requires compensation by deflection behind the visible target to achieve intersection fire." Behind those dry words was the blood-earned truth of thousands of combat missions. Every gunner who survived to see the war's end carried the doctrine in muscle memory. Many could no longer recall how it felt to trust instinct. Their minds had been re-engineered by the science of survival. As victory drew near, the airmen who had once feared the sky had begun to master it. In the summer of 1945, as mushroom clouds rose over Japan and the war's final chapter closed, the last B-29s returned home, their turrets silent, their gunners hollow-eyed. Many had fired their last bursts not in anger, but in weary precision. They had learned to see differently, to interpret motion not as threat but as equation. And when peace came, the lessons they carried would reshape the next era of combat, from Korea's jets to Vietnam's skyborne gunners, and eventually, to the computerized targeting systems that defined modern warfare. But first came the reckoning, the proof of what this strange new way of aiming had truly achieved. In the aftermath of war, data replaced bullets. The films, reports, and statistics would tell the final story of how a single correction in perception had doubled the lethality of American gunners and quietly rewritten the rules of aerial warfare forever. The numbers behind the smoke. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the statistics began to tell their story. Across thousands of missions, tens of thousands of engagements, and hundreds of millions of rounds fired, a subtle pattern emerged. U.S. Army Air Forces analysts, poring over debrief reports and gun camera footage, discovered a startling consistency. Once gunners had been retrained to aim behind, their effectiveness nearly doubled. The 8th Air Force's Air Combat Analysis section documented that between early 1943 and late 1944, average hits per 1,000 rounds fired had increased from 1.2 to nearly 2.5. At first glance, that seemed small. But at high closing speeds, where each tenth of a second meant life or death, it was revolutionary. For every enemy aircraft destroyed, hundreds of lives and millions of dollars worth of bombers were saved. Post-war technical studies at Wright Field, Ohio, analyzed why. The lagging tracer theory was confirmed, but deeper examination revealed that gunners were also benefiting from a psychological effect, delayed firing discipline. The aim-behind doctrine forced them to wait. It made them hesitate just long enough for the enemy to enter the optimal engagement zone. They weren't spraying wildly anymore. They were timing the sky, the human equation. But statistics couldn't capture what it meant to those who lived it. Survivors from the 8th and 15th Air Forces described the same transformation in letters and diaries. Before, one tail gunner from the 390th Bomb Group wrote, "We used to fire early, like panic. You see him coming, you lead him, you pray. Now we wait. We hold. We fire behind and it feels wrong every time. But the tracers find him." Another gunner remembered the first time he trusted the rule completely. You can feel your brain fighting you. You think you're too late, and then the tracers catch. It's like the world slows down for 1 second, just one. And then it's over. For many, the change wasn't just tactical, it was emotional survival. The doctrine gave them something to control in a war that often felt uncontrollable. They began to trust math over fear. And that trust kept them alive. The enemy's view. German and Japanese pilots noticed the shift too. Late-war Luftwaffe intelligence reports, recovered from archives at Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, noted an increased precision of American bomber defensive fire, beginning in late 1943. German aces warned new recruits not to underestimate the sluggish but deadly B-17 and B-24 gun positions. One pilot, Oberleutnant Erich Sommer, wrote after his capture, "Their fire seemed delayed, as if they waited for you. We would roll away, and suddenly the tracers curved into our path. It was uncanny." To the Luftwaffe, it appeared as if the Americans had improved their gunnery sights overnight. In truth, they had simply changed how they thought. By 1944, the air over Europe had become lethal to interceptors. The German High Command even considered specialized armored attack tactics because frontal approaches, once the preferred strike angle, had become suicidal against disciplined defensive fire. Every miss that hit behind the nose of a fighter was a symptom of a new kind of warfare. Psychological, analytical, and devastatingly efficient. Doctrine carved in reports. The lessons were institutionalized almost immediately. In 1946, the newly independent U.S. Air Force commissioned Project TACT, Tactical Aerial Combat Training. Its findings reiterated that defensive gunners were most effective when trained to aim in deflection lag, counterintuitive to natural tracking instincts. By 1948, this principle was written into Air Force Manual 64-0-1. Due to optical and ballistic lag, deflection aiming must be adjusted opposite to intuitive motion. Fire must be initiated when target appears aft of lead point. That one line, buried in a technical document few civilians ever read, summarized a doctrine that had changed aerial warfare forever. Yet beneath the dry terminology lay something deeply human: the power to see beyond instinct. From the frozen skies of Europe to the burning clouds over Japan, American gunners had proven that survival could be engineered through understanding. But even in victory, the cost lingered. The men who had mastered this strange art of delayed action carried it home, into civilian life, where that patience and precision no longer had a place. For them, the sky never fully quieted. When the war ended, the men who had spent years inside aluminum shells returned to a world that felt impossibly still. They had been trained to make split-second decisions at 25,000 feet, to read motion like a language, to aim wrong so they could be right. Now, back home, the horizon didn't move anymore. For the gunners of the 8th and 20th Air Forces, the lessons of aiming behind lingered not only as a tactical truth, but as a mental reflex. Some described an instinct to wait before reacting in ordinary life. The pause that had once saved them followed them into every quiet moment. Military psychologists at the time noted that former aerial gunners displayed extraordinary composure under pressure, yet also an almost mechanical detachment from danger. They had learned to delay their instincts, to override fear, and that rewiring, once vital, became a ghost that never left. The doctrine had changed not just how they fought, but how they thought. Lessons transferred. The Korean War erupted barely 5 years later, and the aim-behind philosophy returned, this time with jet contrails instead of piston engines. American tail gunners aboard B-29s again found themselves under attack, now from MiG-15s moving nearly twice as fast as wartime fighters. To hit these targets, deflection errors grew enormous, sometimes 10 or 20 degrees. The gunners who had once fought over Germany found themselves explaining to new recruits that you never shoot where he is. You shoot where he was going, but even that's too far forward. Radar-assisted sights like the AN/APG-15B automated much of the work, but the fundamental principle remained: trust the instruments, not your instincts. And once again, it worked. During the Korean conflict, B-29 defensive fire scored confirmed kills against some of the fastest aircraft in the world, proof that a lesson born in the skies of 1943 had survived the jet age. This same mental shift, a willingness to question perception, would later influence the design of modern targeting computers, missile tracking systems, and even early spaceflight navigation. Every modern fire control system still compensates for apparent lag and optical illusion, the same error first discovered by those cold hands gripping Browning triggers over Europe. Myth and memory. 4 decades after the war, veterans' reunions often turned into quiet seminars about the day it clicked, the moment they realized they were aiming behind on purpose. Many struggled to explain it to their families. How could they tell their children that the secret to survival had been learning to see the world wrong? Historians, too, were slow to grasp its significance. Most accounts of air combat focused on the bombers, the missions, the strategy. The subtle mental revolution of the gunners, this tiny shift in how the human brain processed motion under fire, remained buried in training reports and manuals. Only in the late 1970s, when declassified U.S. Army Air Forces studies were released, did the full picture emerge. What looked like superstition, aim behind, was in fact the first large-scale application of human-machine feedback in combat. It was a fusion of psychology, ballistics, and instinct, decades before the term cybernetics entered the lexicon. The wrong aim had been the right answer all along. Legacy in the digital era. Today, every modern aerial combat simulator, from fighter jet HUDs to drone control systems, compensates for visual lag. The algorithms that guide automated gun turrets, close-in weapon systems, and air defense platforms all rely on equations first refined by hand-cranked analog computers in 1943. Even the tracers, those glowing lines that once deceived the eye, are now digitally modeled to correct for the same optical illusion that once cost men their lives. The legacy of those lessons isn't just in technology. It's in mindset, the understanding that human perception, unaided, is flawed. That instinct can mislead. That precision demands humility before data. And it all began with a gunner staring through a frost-covered sight, realizing the only way to hit his enemy was to trust the math more than himself. The war was over. The skies were quiet. But the principle endured, in circuits, in doctrine, and in every future soldier taught to see the world as it truly moves, not as it appears. And from that silence rises the final reflection, what this strange, counterintuitive lesson ultimately meant for the evolution of war, and for the minds of those who fought it. The war had ended, but its mathematics endured. In every major conflict since 1945, from Korea to Vietnam to the Persian Gulf, the doctrine of correction through contradiction has remained an invisible heirloom of the Second World War. It reminds us that victory is not only about strength, but about understanding. When those American gunners learned to aim behind their targets, they were doing more than adjusting for tracer lag. They were redefining how humans interact with machines, how intuition yields to calculation, and how survival can depend on the courage to trust logic over instinct. They had taken one of humanity's oldest reflexes, to lead what moves, and reversed it through science. And in doing so, they glimpsed a deeper truth about war. That technology does not replace the human mind, it transforms it. Their lesson became timeless. In every field where speed outpaces perception, aviation, computing, even modern robotics, the principle is the same. Data must correct the eye. Systems must account for illusion. The aim behind doctrine is no longer about guns or bombers. It's about awareness, about learning to see past what we think we know. Standing today beneath the restored wings of a B-17 in a museum hangar, one can almost hear the low hum of those engines and the rattle of the old Brownings. It's easy to forget that the men who sat behind those guns weren't just warriors. They were early test pilots of human cognition under fire. Each time they pulled the trigger a fraction too late, they were rewriting a small piece of what it meant to be precise in an imperfect world. In that frozen sky, amid tracer arcs and smoke trails, the United States Army Air Forces discovered something profound, that in the chaos of battle, survival often belongs not to the strongest or the bravest, but to the one who can see clearly enough to aim just a little behind. The skies of war have long since fallen silent. But that lesson, the art of waiting, the courage to be wrong for the sake of being right, still echoes quietly in every cockpit, every weapon system, and every mind that dares to measure truth against instinct.